I spoke to many people who knew Nellie Melba. J. Sutton Crowe was one who remembered her at her peak.
She could be most dignified, and at the same time, she could throw dignity away and be quite normal
and even quite rough at times.
Oh, yes. Oh, she could be rough. That's why I say she used to talk to Master Hall in such a way and tell him what to do. I thought, by Jove, I don't know that I'd like that if I were a conductor.
And Edrik Henty told me...
Rather a severe type of character, you know. She never smiled much or anything like that, you know. She gave me the impression of being rather a ruthless character. Didn't show very much affection at any time. But on the other hand, of course, she had a particularly kind nature, which I don't think was ever really properly appreciated.
She must have had enormous personal authority.
Terrific. Was that an inherent thing and a part of her intelligence, or did she gather that as she gathered her great success at Covent Garden and so on?
No, that was absolutely natural, inborn. Couldn't be acquired, what Dame Nellie, the charm of Dame Nellie. Oh, yeah, I'm on the snobbish side, you know, sometimes.
So says Peter Dawson, the Australian bass-baritone, and another famous baritone, John Brownlee, considers...
I think the word electrical is really what explains Melba more than anything else. Things were always happening. It was always exciting wherever Melba was.
One of Melba's associate artists for many, many years was John Amadio, the flautist, who will never forget her voice.
Of course, she was miraculous, the control. The one outstanding quality she had was the steadiness of her voice. If you hear any of her old recordings put on now, even with the imperfect recording of her day, you'll notice that wonderful, pure steadiness, like Caruso.
Sir Bernard Heinz considers...
A young, fresh, beautiful voice, full of luster, full of beauty, clear and pure. That was one of the most extraordinary things about her voice, I think more than anything else, the absolute purity of it. There was no effort visible to the naked eye. There was, of course, a physical effort of her own made, but it created no disturbance to her physical being. The sort of thing that one sees so frequently in other artists. You know, a flushing of the face or a filling of the throat. Nothing of the sort with her. The thing flowed freely and with the greatest possible beauty.
Was that helped, do you think, by the fact that she was a woman of extremely good constitution? She was a powerful woman.
Oh, yes. She was a powerful woman, but not fat. She was a well-built and big woman. But it was all good, strong, earnest being.
Those are some brief impressions of the brilliantly gifted Diva, who was born in Melbourne on the 19th of May, 1861. She flowered and flourished as a singer in the last years of Queen Victoria, and she reached the height of her career in the reign of Edward VII. Never in history have the fortunate ones of the earth seemed more secure than they did in that brief epoch of plush and of lavish gilding, of osprey feathers and bell-toppers, of hansom cabs and of gaslight, of princes and prima donnas. The feel, the flavour, the bloom of Dame Nellie Melba's heyday are, alas, no longer recoverable at first hand. Few living people remember her at her best. Till the very end of her life, though, Melba herself retained the brains and the personality which had carried her up and up. Wilfrid Thomas, the broadcaster, has never forgotten an encounter shortly before she died. Unbeknown to him, Miss Mabel Batchelor had mentioned his singing to Melba when she was visiting Sydney. And Wilfrid Thomas remembers...
The great thing about her, as far as we were concerned, was that she was the first Australian artist to go abroad, to go to Europe, and to tell the world and show the world that we could produce something besides sheep and convicts and boomerangs and aborigines and so on. We had this legend of, champagne and Grand Dukes throwing diamonds the size of the crown jewels from the boxes, and all this romantic stuff. And I think the sum total of it all was that we didn't regard her with tremendous affection, but more with awe, And it happened in a singing studio, a music studio in Sydney, at lunchtime one day. I was practicing there with a pianist friend of mine named Dick Thew. And the door was suddenly flung open, and there, framed by the varnished lintels, stood this diamond fur character, the Queen of Song, and she advanced in a sort of imperious manner, and behind her, coming out of the shadows, were her manager, John Lamoni, and Mabel Batchelor, who was the lessee of the studio. And she advanced towards me, and she said, "What's your name?" I said, "Wilfrid Thomas." I was terrified. And she said, "How old are you?" I said, 21, madam, please, She said, my God, I wish I were. Then she said, all right, well, sing. So we dug into the old music bag and pulled out my most ambitious aria, you see, which was a Handel aria called Hear Me, Ye Winds and Waves. There's a big dramatic introduction on the piano, and I go, from the rage of the tempest, out of the seething water, so far the gods protect me. And she said, I don't want to hear any more. I felt very crestfallen. She said, don't you know any ballads? And I said, oh, yes. And we pulled another song out of the bag, which was a little hunting song by Franco Leone called Tally Ho. And it goes like this, something about, there's a noise of galloping over the hill, and the hunter's horn rings merry and shrill. See, here they come with a view, halloo, hounds and horses and huntsmen too, galloping, 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 galloping by. I was very proud of this song. And while I was singing this, Melba hoisted up her skirts and started to dance around the studio, prancing around with her hat tipped on the side of her head and yelling out, tally-ho, tally-ho, which... I mean, now we'd be very amused, wouldn't we? But
this must have completely shattered you.
Shattered me. This was the great empress. I mean, it was, I couldn't believe that this great dignified character should behave in this manner. Anyway, she then pulled up and walked towards me, staring me in the eyes, and she said, your consonants, your diction, she said, she was trying to give me a lesson. I didn't realize it at the time. She said, I've never forgotten what Ellen Terry said to me. She said, Melba, have you ever been tipsy? See, accentuating the labials, the consonants. I just didn't know what to say when she said this to me. And then she swept Dixie off the piano stool and pulled her gloves off and started to play scales and vocal exercises, which I had to sing. And then when she'd had enough, she plonked the old the cover of the piano down, pulled on her gloves, stood up, and without hardly saying goodbye or anything else, just stamped out of the studio. And Dick and I just looked at each other, flabbergasted. We didn't know what had happened to us, like being struck by lightning or something. And then, a few seconds after this, Lamoni came back into the studio and said to me, Madam likes you.
Well, after that, of course, Wilfrid Thomas thought he was made. And he might have been too, indeed, if Melba had lived and had helped him. That is a tale, however, from the latter end of her life. Nobody now can tell us of when she was Nellie Mitchell, before she became Mrs. Armstrong in 1882. She did not stay with her husband after the birth of her son. Bent on an operatic career, she sailed for Europe in 1886, when she was 25. She studied with Madame Marchesi in Paris, and at the end of the same year, in a concert at Marchesi's house, she used for the first time the name of Madame Melba, after her native city. In 1887, she starred in Rigoletto at Brussels, and from then on she never looked back. But Lindley Evans, the pianist, who for several years was her accompanist, remembers her telling him how she nearly failed to get started at all. Marchesi had so many good students that powerful entrepreneurs would often visit her studio in order to look them over.
So one day somebody turned up and she said that she'd got a young Australian. So the young Australian was produced and sang, and this chap was very interested in her, and he immediately offered her a contract. And that was that, and nothing much happened. Not very much later, someone else came in. And he not only offered her a contract, but he offered her an engagement to sing in Brussels on a certain night, which Marchesi told Melba to sign, but she said she couldn't sign it because she'd already signed it with one for with this other man, you see. And Marchesi said, oh, don't worry about him, he's a great friend of mine, everything will be all right, I'll fix it, you see. So Melba signed this contract and dearly went off to Brussels. No sooner had she got in Brussels than she was confronted with a writ which the first man had taken out to prevent her from singing. And there she was, living by herself, with this opportunity that she'd come across the world for, suddenly confronted with this, and the whole foundation seemed to have been taken away from beneath her. Nothing to do, nothing. What could she do? So she was in her room sort of hardly hearing what happened. Days went by until the Friday night, when suddenly there was a commotion below, and she walked out of her room to see what was all going out, and someone calling her name. And it was some maid or some friend or someone who knew the circumstances to say that the first man had dropped dead. So she went on with her engagement, and the next day she was famous throughout Europe. She created such a terrific sensation that opening night in Brussels that it was the beginning of it.
That was the beginning. But it was still only the beginning. Ruth Ladd, of the Sydney Conservatorium, was one of the many girls whom Melba in later years used to invite to luncheon at Coombe Cottage at Coldstream.
At lunch one day, she said, "Did I ever tell you the story of how I received my first contract for Monte Carlo?" So somebody said no. "Well," she said, "I had made my debut in Brussels, and it was a great success. And then there was really nothing much doing, and I was wondering, more or less, where the next money was coming from. So she went down to Monte Carlo, where she heard that the Prima Donna had made a flop of the season, and the manager apparently was very anxious and wanted really to find somebody else. However, he wasn't going to let Melba know that, and Melba wasn't going to let him know that she was anxious to get the job. So she arranged it that she met this man, and he asked her to afternoon tea somewhere. So they went to some restaurant, and of course, last conversation, as it was meant to do, came round to this flop this woman had made. So this man said, "You wouldn't consider it, of course. I hear you've done extraordinarily well in Brussels." So Melba said, "Oh, no, just finished the season there, and I feel that I'd like a rest now. I've got my French maid and George with me, so we're just going to rest." Oh, so nothing more was said. So this man said, "Well, I trust that you will come and have tea with me again." So Melba said, "Yes, she'd be very happy to." You see. So another date was fixed. So once again they hedged. And at last he said, "You wouldn't consider, if I made the offer tempting enough, you wouldn't consider taking on this season?" And she said, "Oh, well, it depends entirely upon what you consider a tempting offer." So he made her what at the time was quite a fabulous offer, and she said, "Oh, if you like to treble it, yes." So he said, "Right." So they turned the menu over and made out the contract there and then. He told us that at lunch.
Success, you see, didn't fall into her lap. She had to resist her father's opposition in the beginning, and she had to work for her success. She had to fight for it. She had to go out and seize it. She seized it with both hands, and 7 months after her debut at Brussels, where she sang the part of Gilda in Rigoletto, she appeared at Covent Garden in Lucia di Lammermoor. A year later, she captured Paris as Ophelia in Thomas' Hamlet. Next, she went off to St. Petersburg, singing with the famous Doreskis. In 1893, she made her debut at La Scala, again singing Lucia, and at the end of the same year, she made her debut in New York. She essayed some of the lighter Wagnerian roles, but in 1896 she ventured on the role of Brunhilde. This was too heavy for Melba, and it very nearly wrecked her voice. For most critics in England and America, she was unquestionably the world's most notable lyric and coloratura soprano for at least some 20 years. She was certainly much more famous than any other Australian, and for a whole generation of opera lovers, her name was almost synonymous with those of her favourite roles: Gilda, Desdemona, Lucia, Marguerite, Violetta, Mimi. A whole legend grew up around Melba, and little of it was kindly. One story that circulated for years, many Australians never forgave her for it, was that she told Clara Butt to sing a muck when that celebrated contralto was about to visit this country. Melba, of course, if she said it, was dead right, for in those days the appreciation of music in Australia was almost non-existent. William James, the composer, says that Melba could not move without people saying, "Melba did this," or "Melba did that," or even "Melba was drunk." He and many others who worked with her closely for years declared that she never drank. At most, and very rarely, she would take one glass of champagne. Most people thought that Melba was a witty woman. They did not all agree that she had a real sense of humour. I spoke to Queenie Ashton, the actress, whom Melba once helped as a singer. What would you say of her humour? Was it rather refined?
Oh, heavens no, John. Oh, no. She had a delightful sense of humour, but she loved things which were a little risque, a lovely sense of fun. She'd come out with a few swear words occasionally, you know. She didn't mind.
What was her laugh like?
Raucous. It really was. Extremely raucous. You just couldn't think of that laugh coming from that woman who had that beautiful voice. She was terribly John Blunt, you know. Oh, just speak her mind. I mean, when she said to me, "My God, girl, your voice has been ruined. I don't know what Dingelly's done to it." And it was a voice rather like that. You couldn't think that it was the same voice when she sang, you know, that this beautiful voice came out.
It would be a poor compliment to a great personality to pretend that Melba had no failings, but she had extraordinary merits. Gertrude Johnson of the National Theatre says,
I think the great thing of her was that tenacity, and she'd have been a success in anything that she'd undertaken. If she'd have had a milliner's shop, well, hers would be the best milliner's shop in the street.
Ruth Ladd would agree with that.
Well, she said to us one day, "I must have perfection." And she turned to Fritz Hart and she said, "Fritz, if I'd been a housemaid, I'd have been the best in Australia. I couldn't help it. It's got to be perfection for me."
Well, Fritz Hart, who was director of the Albert Street Conservatorium, is alas no longer alive. But his son, Basil Hart, vividly remembers...
She had a tremendous amount of physical energy and also a very quick brain. As a businesswoman, I think that she would probably have been able to run the ICI or any of the big business concerns. Her energy was such that she could wear out any 3 younger people in the course of the day. Always on the go.
She was always on the go, and she loved to organize things and take charge. Peter Dawson remembers that she did not hesitate to take charge of a concert, a charity concert at which he was performing many, many years ago in England.
I went along to sing, and I sang a set of Parry songs. Nellie was sitting in the front of this hall, and there was all the league sitting in the front there with Nellie, big as you like, all very pleased, and I came on and started. She said, "Peter," she said, "wait a minute, no, don't start yet, no." So I stopped and I looked. She said, "There's no light on you. Where are the technicians? Where are they? Where's the electricians? Bring the electricians, come on." And I was still standing there. I thought, "Good God, what's this?" See? So they come scampering in. They say, "Look, that border, bring a border over there and do this and do the other, you see. And take that away there. You want some light on this. You see, you can't see Peter Dawson there. He might be a trapdoor spider." See? So anyway, I was enjoying all this. Then she said, "Now, that one over there, yes, that's right. Now, just a minute." And she got up from her seat and she walked back 3 or 4 seats then in the aisle and looked. She said, "Yes, that's better. All right, Peter." She came back and sat down. So I said, "Oh, thank you very much, Madam Nellie." I said, "I can start now." She said, "Yes, go on. It's all yours." So I sang these Parry songs.
You see, Melba knew her trade. She understood the whole art of public appearance. For her, nothing but the best was good enough. As her niece, Nell Wood, the painter, remembers...
She was a perfectionist, and I've seen her at the theatre spending hours of time not only attending to what she had to do herself, her own job, which goodness knows was hard enough, but looking at the lighting, looking at the dressing, seeing how the stage set was going to be set, and all that kind of thing, attending to the scenery, seeing that it was fresh. And because she was so good at those things, she was impatient with people who were slovenly. And I've seen people do a slovenly job or walk on to a stage badly or drop the character in which they were acting halfway through, sort of relax and get tired when they should have been there getting into character to go on with the part again. These things would irritate her, and I think quite rightly.
Now, it has been mentioned that Melba was a very good businesswoman, could drive a hard bargain. And Lindley Evans remembers that she was very businesslike and very downright when she engaged him to travel overseas as her concert accompanist.
I got the feeling that, this is a strictly business affair and that's all there is to it. But I hadn't been in London more than a week or so when she casually said to me one day, she said, "Look," she said, "if you're ever short of money," she said, "you come and ask me." She said, "I've got plenty of money." So you see, it wasn't quite what you'd think. You see, I had to get to know her, and I knew her so well.
What was she like to work with?
Well, at first, of course, I thought I'd never stand it, because she was a person who knew exactly what she wanted and was determined to have it at all costs and at any price, as you can imagine. I mean, she was frightfully pernickety over things. Let me give you a sample now. She was singing some French songs, some new French songs. She was learning them. Well, now, she spoke French, you know, and Italian as fluently as she spoke English. And yet when she had learnt those French songs for the first time, and she knew them as well as it was possible to know them from the musical side, she then, before she sang them in public, called in a cultivated Frenchwoman to hear her sing them to make sure that her French was impeccable. Well, that sort of thing. You see, we used to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse until things went sideways. And even such things as your dress, I always just had to turn round each night when I came round into the artist's room to see that everything was all right, you know, from the sartorial point of view.
Now, so far, we have not tried to follow Melba year by year. We've tried rather to capture the excitement, the tension, the glamour that surrounded her wherever she went. People have mentioned her bluntness, her strength, her business ability, and it would be easy to assume that she was only a self-centered woman bent on personal advancement. This would be most unfair to her. She was certainly ambitious, imperious, but she was very much more than that. As a singer, she ranks with many great names of the past, with Patti, Caruso, and so on, but she still belongs to the past. And if she had been only a singer, she might have been well-nigh forgotten. Even when alive, she complained that some people knew her only by a sweet, pêche Melba, that the master of master chefs, Escoffier, created for her. She was more than a singer, however. As a woman of outstanding intelligence, and above all as a teacher, Melba is still a living force. She realized, it seems, when she was in her 50s, that a whole field of new and useful activity was open to her. The Albert Street Conservatorium in Melbourne was then under the direction of Fritz Hart. Fritz Hart, as we said, is gone. But Basil Hart, his son, remembers what Melba did.
Melba suddenly, in 1915, rang my father and said, Fritz Hart, it's Melba speaking, Nellie Melba. I want to start a school of singing at your conservatorium. She did that. I think it's important that people should realize that Melba did not receive 1 penny for any of the work that she did at the conservatorium. It was all voluntary work. She founded the school. She trained the teachers, Mary Campbell, Anne Williams, and they in turn have trained other teachers to follow on in the Melba method. For instance, I can think of Ruth Ladd, who is doing such excellent work at the Sydney Conservatorium.
Yes, I've spoken to her. She says that Melba was an absolute inspiration as a teacher.
Well, we used to meet in the hall, perhaps twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, for lessons, the idea being that it was admirable for those people who intended to teach to listen to the lessons of other people. We all had our nicknames, which was rather funny, and Madam would say, "Come along, little mouse, I'll give you your lesson." So little mouse would get up, stand on the platform, and have to sing. We had another one called the Rabbit. She lives in Western Australia, a girl with a magnificent voice. I myself was known as the Duchess, not because of my magnificence, but because of my resemblance to the Duchess of Leinster. Well, those lessons were a magnificent experience. Nothing but perfection pleased Dame Nellie. She wouldn't listen to anything else. Any forcing of the voice, ugly tone, she would just immediately clap her hands over her ears and say, "Don't screech like a cat. If you force your voice, you cannot come to this class. I will not take the responsibility." And, of course, she was always stressing the importance of a sound musical knowledge. Many, many times people came for auditions, and she would say to the young singer, "How old are you?" 16. "Go away and learn the piano until you're 18 and come back to me when you have some musical knowledge." Of course, Melba herself was a magnificent pianist before she was a singer at all.
Yes, as a matter of fact, she was not only a fine pianist, but she was an excellent violinist and a capable organist, too. That's by the way, however. The point is that Melba threw herself heart and soul into the teaching of singing and the encouragement of youthful talent. Although she still went abroad from time to time, she poured out all her knowledge whenever she came back to Melbourne. Basil Hart remembers that she loved to make friends of her students.
They were terribly frightened of her in many ways, but she used to have annual parties up at Coombe Cottage for the Conservatorium girls, and these days they'd call them barbecues. Perhaps 100 girls would go up to Coombe Cottage and they'd be out in the grounds there and they'd be cooking their chops round fires, and Melba would be there with a chef's cap.
Was she really?
Dashing about. Full of good humour.
That's delightful. I love the chef's cap.
Yeah.
She really put a chef's cap
on?
on?
She put a chef's cap on.
Lovely parties we used to have. And then the driver of the car would report that we were singing all the way home, and then we'd hear about it the next morning. That's not the thing to do. You won't have any voices left if you do that. But her home was beautiful. It really was lovely.
What did you think of her as a teacher?
Oh, first class. She had a very, very strong feeling for musical phrasing and that kind of thing, and she demanded very good diction. She used to say, it's brains, 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 then voice. You must live, you must feel, you must read, you must have background to become a singer. You've got to think.
Gertrude Johnson said that. And Mary Bremner, who made such a name for herself in charming musical comedies. Mary Bremner remembers.
When I was at the Conservatorium, there were about 60 or 70 students at the time, and she had designed for us what we called our long white nightgowns. They were on the whole fairly plain, straight up and down, white uniforms, and on the left breast or pocket we wore a badge which she had designed herself. It was a green ribbon of a most attractive colour, and it had a fine blue and white line on the edge of the ribbon, and in the centre of it was a laurel wreath, a white laurel wreath, with the letter M in blue. Above it was a dove, a white dove, with a spray in its mouth, and underneath was, in a scroll, Con Amore, so that our studies and our singing lessons and everything that we did attached to the Conservatorium were to be approached with love. We saw a tremendous lot of her when she was in Australia, because she used to visit the Conservatorium at the most unexpected times. You never knew when she was going to drop in, and it was rather frightening to one day be having a lesson and the door would open and there she would be. And she would say to the teacher, whoever it happened to be, I'll take over, and brush her aside and sit down at the piano and give you a lesson. I was having a lesson one day when she came in, and she taught me a little song called Obstination by Fontenaille. And even now I can hear her, when I sing that song, I can hear her singing it in her lovely, clear, liquid, well, it wasn't a liquid, it was a silver quality, a voice which we have never been able to repeat in the world.
And what was she like? I spoke to Florence Yates. What was she like to deal with when she was actually teaching?
Dogmatic, I would say. She was very much the teacher, and insisted on good, hard work, and that's all there was to it. And if you didn't work, well, she just didn't bother anymore.
But if you did work?
If you did work, well, she'd help you.
Yes, Lauri and Dorothy Kennedy speak of the help she gave, her generous attitude, her...
If you helped yourself after she'd given you a lift in or encouragement in one way, and you did something, she was so proud, to think that you could do something. And there were instances where people just didn't do anything if she wasn't at their beck and all the time. And she just said to me, well, I just can't stand these spoon-fed people if they won't strike out for themselves.
And she just dropped them?
She just dropped them. No two ways about it.
But look how many she helped.
Do you remember that program at some Earl Farquhar's house or some big person?
Oh, that was a terrific affair, yes.
All Australians on the program.
Yes, all Australians. And it was a remarkable affair because there were three queens. The Queen of England, Mary, the Queen of Norway, and the Queen of Italy. And after that we were presented, each one of us presented to Queen Mary. And what was remarkable about Melba was her terms of familiarity with royalty over there. It was very funny, this presentation, because naturally royalty doesn't know what to say to you at times, and she couldn't think of anything to say to me, the Queen, so she looked at me and she said, you have a wonderful touch. Well, maybe I had, maybe I hadn't, but Melba took it up quickly, because the Queen then followed this up and said, I suppose you have a wonderful instrument. And Melba positively nudged her in the ribs and said, he'll have a better one, madam, when he can afford it.
fishing, of course, you see, that the Queen might give me a Stradivari or something, but that didn't eventuate, I'm sorry to relate.
Melba used her influence, her money, and above all her knowledge to encourage and aid her successors. She helped the Kennedys and many, many others. Gladys Moncrieff, before her career began, was invited one afternoon to sing 2 songs in the empty Theatre Royal. There were no lights on in the stalls. She didn't quite know why she was asked to give this audition.
It was very dark, and I couldn't see anybody. So at the end of the 2 numbers, Mr. Wood came on the stage, and with him was Melba. And, of course, I was very excited. And she sat down at the piano, and for about a half an hour, she gave me a lesson. I was singing scales and little exercises here and there. So all of a sudden, she said, "Now sing this for me." And I sang up and up and up and up and got up to top C. Oh, I said I couldn't go anymore. She said, come on, up to the side. Another semitone. And then I sang C sharp, then I went up to D, and she said, "Now come on the next one." I was so afraid. Anyhow, I sang the next note. She said, "There," and jumped up from the piano. She said, "That was E and alt, and that's wonderful." And she said, "Mr. Wood said he's going to do something very wonderful for you." And she said, "If he does it, I think your future career is assured." But I remember too, Melba, Mrs. Hugh Ward taught me singing, and Melba gave Mrs. Ward these little exercises for my voice, which was, it had a break in the middle register. Mm-hmm. But it was wonderful for me because I'd go so far, and then this break would come, and there wouldn't be any voice, and I'd sing right up high. But she just bridged it right over, and then eventually people used to say it was the best part of my voice, was the middle voice.
Melba often went out of her way to help other musicians by attending their concerts, or even taking part in them. And Mary Bremner remembers...
There was a young girl who was brought to her one day, a girl called Wilma Barclay. And Melba was taken with her voice and said that she'd like to help her and like to give her a concert. She said to her, "Now, I will help you, and you go away and get yourself together a trousseau and a dress and let me know what it's like." So she came up one day. She was a very shy person. And Melba said to her, "Well, have you got your dress?" And she said, "Yes, here it is." And she showed her a frock that she was going to wear, and she said, "No, you can't wear that. That's only good for a school concert." And she said to Mary Campbell, who was my teacher, "Now, Mary, do your stuff." And with that, she went out of the room. Well, Mary bent down and picked up from underneath the piano, the grand piano, a gold box. She put it on the top of the piano and said, "There you are, Wilma, that's for you." And Wilma Barclay opened it. And after she'd taken away the tissue paper, there was everything that she was to wear at her concert. From the chaplet of gold leaves for her hair to the gold shoes that she would wear on her feet. The girl, of course, was quite overcome, and they were all in perfect measurement. Melba had done that surreptitiously on the side. She was a most generous person, and she hated to be thanked for anything. In her bluff manner, she'd more or less brush you aside and say, "Oh, tut, 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 no, that's all right, that's all right." And then, of course, she was so generous to other people. John Brownlee, for instance, do you remember?
Another example of her generosity, and this, I believe, has never been published before, is that in 1920 she paid all expenses for her nephew, Gerald Patterson, so that he could go to England to defend his world tennis title at Wimbledon. Gerald Patterson told me that himself. And Melba was not mean, certainly not in those years, even with the most precious secrets of her art. Gertrude Johnson, while she was still a student, was approached by people who were planning to form an Italian-Australian opera company. They told her they needed a coloratura soprano.
And I missed my lesson to go to the audition with the agent. And when I arrived, I was, of course, full of enthusiasm to tell Dame Nellie. But she was furious with me. How dare I come late for a lesson, you see? And so all my ardor was frozen, and she never heard of it till I was actually away in Queensland singing with them. Again, she was furious with me. I should have told her everything, you see. But it wasn't always very easy to tell her everything. And then when I came back to see her, she said, "You're not a student, you're a prima donna now. You don't need me." In a very hurt voice. But after a short time, she got over it. And gave me marvelous cadenzas for things that I later sang on the other side of the world. But she could get very cross with you. And you remembered it when she was cross.
She gave you cadenzas, that's
yes,
interesting.
The special cadenzas that she herself with Madame Marchese had evolved. And she made me take copies of these so that I should have them when my opportunity came, which of course was a wonderful thing to do.
Dame Nellie Melba died in 1931 due to an unlucky infection. She was buried at Lilydale, and the whole nation literally mourned her loss. An incredible vitality was quenched, an incomparable voice was silenced. It is our great misfortune that pre-electric recordings cannot do justice to the rarest of her many gifts. But to those who have heard her voice, in its prime or even in its extended autumn, the words of Percy Grainger, the Australian pianist and composer, will bring back a little of its wonder.
I think she had a very high standard of workmanship. She herself worked very hard at everything, knew all details, and had mastered, I think, every technique of her art. And she liked it in others, too, of course.
She probably felt that her own voice was in a distinctive class, though.
Well, my goodness, it was. I'm not particularly fond of opera singers as a rule, and I must say I've never heard anything to compare with the beauty of Melba's voice in any branch of singing. The top notes, of course, were very ringing and telling, as they are with a good many fine sopranos. But the curious thing with Melba was that her lower notes and her middle notes were equally telling. They had a quality all of their own, and even when she was singing with a big orchestra, she was never wiped out. She had a tremendous carrying power and a tremendous beauty of tone and very great refinement of workmanship in everything that she did.
And finally, Dr. A.E. Floyd, formerly the organist of St. Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne, who in recent years has endeared himself to radio listeners by his innumerable broadcasts of great music. Dr. Floyd remembers.
Of course, I never heard her in the middle of her great operatic career. I first heard her here in Melbourne a little over 40 years ago, I think, and I remember that when she began to sing, I said to myself, is this the great world-famous Melba? And then I gradually realized that she had switched over from the coloratura arias with which she'd made a great name in her heyday in Europe. She realized that she had to treat her voice with consideration, and she'd switched over to atmospheric French songs, which gave her unique opportunity of using the best part of her voice, and it had an indescribable quality. I think the nearest to a true description that I've ever read is in that rather disagreeable book written by a man who was, at an earlier stage, a protege of hers, but who later wrote a rather disagreeable novel. I think it was called Evensong. But he does, in the course of the book, give a description of a party in a big house in London, Melba present, and somebody persuades her to sing, perhaps her hostess. And, says Beverly Nichols, she stood up, and there came on the air that voice like a disembodied spirit, like a little boy's voice, that seemed to come, I don't know whether he says this, or whether it's what I say, in a very deliberate effort to tell the truth, as I see it. It seemed to come from everywhere and from nowhere. There it was in the air, poised and perfect.